The mare's scream tore through the autumn air like something feral and ancient, a sound that didn't belong to any creature meant for saddle or bridle. Inside the Pinewood Livestock Exchange, men stepped back from the rail as handlers dragged her into the auction ring, her hooves striking sparks against the concrete where sawdust had been kicked away. Her coat was the color of old blood in failing light, dark bay shading to near black along her flanks, and her eyes rolled white with a rage that seemed to have no bottom. Someone in the crowd muttered a prayer. Another spat tobacco juice and shook his head. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer, Dutch Carmichael, a man whose voice had sold everything from prize bulls to bankrupt farmland, hesitated with the gavel halfway raised. In 30 years of standing in that ring, he had never seen anything that moved quite like this mare moved, all coiled violence and borrowed time, as if she were merely waiting for the right moment to make someone pay for every wrong ever done to her. The handlers kept their distance, poles extended, and when one of them got careless and let the rope slacken, the mare lunged so fast the movement blurred. Her teeth snapped shut on empty air 3 inches from the man's forearm, and the sound of those jaws closing echoed like a rifle crack. The crowd surged back as one body. A woman clutched her husband's sleeve. Garrett Voss, standing near the front in a jacket too clean for a livestock barn, threw his head back and laughed, the kind of laugh that carries contempt like a disease. His white gelding, Sterling, stood tied outside in a custom trailer that cost more than most families in Pinewood Hollow earned in a year, and everyone knew it. Garrett made sure everyone knew it. "This is what happens when people think they can break a horse with cruelty," he said loud enough to carry. "Some animals are born wrong. This one should have been put down years ago." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. The mare paced the width of the ring, head low, muscles bunched beneath skin that bore the white lines of old scars. Her mane hung in tangles, and her tail, once it might have been beautiful, now resembled something dragged through barbed wire and left to rot. Dutch cleared his throat and tried to salvage the moment with the practiced ease of a man who'd sold worse. "Folks, we've got here a 7-year-old mare. Good bone structure, strong chest. She's had a rough go, I'll grant you that, but there's potential if someone's got the patience. Let's start the bidding at $500. Silence answered him, the kind of silence that feels like judgment. Someone coughed. A child whimpered and was shushed. The mare stopped pacing and turned to face the crowd, her gaze sweeping across them with something that looked unsettlingly like recognition, as if she knew exactly what they thought of her and had already decided they weren't worth the effort of her hatred. Dutch tried again, his voice losing some of its polish. "403. Anyone." The laughter started small, a chuckle from the back, then spread like fire through dry kindling. Men slapped their knees. Women whispered behind their hands. Garrett Voss leaned against the rail and called out, "I'll give you $50 if you throw in a bullet and save us all the trouble." The laughter doubled. Even Dutch cracked a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. The mare's nostrils flared, steam rising in the cold air of the barn, and for a moment the light through the high windows caught her just right, turning her coat to flame. She looked like something out of an old story, the kind where the monster turns out to have been a princess all along. But nobody here believed in those stories anymore. They believed in what they could see, and what they saw was a ruined animal that would cost more to feed than she'd ever be worth. At the very back of the crowd, pressed against the splintered wood of the far wall where the shadows gathered thick, stood a child so still she might have been mistaken for part of the architecture. Wren Holloway was 9 years old and small for her age, with dark hair that fell across her face like a curtain she could hide behind. She wore a jacket 2 sizes too big, handed down from her cousin Jasper, and her boots were held together with duct tape that had gone gray with age. Her Aunt Iris had brought her to the auction because there was nowhere else to leave her. Not since the accident. Not since Wren's mother had died and words had stopped coming out of Wren's mouth the way they used to. The doctors called it selective mutism, a response to trauma, and said it might pass with time. Iris called it one more impossible thing in a year full of them. Wren hadn't spoken in 4 months. Not at the funeral, not when they moved her things into the old mill house by Crooked Creek. Not when the kids at school whispered and pointed. But she could still see, and what she saw now, looking at the mare in that ring, was something the adults had stopped being able to recognize. She saw the way the mare's ears flicked toward every sound, hyper-aware, ready for the next blow. She saw the trembling in the mare's flanks that had nothing to do with cold and everything to do with exhaustion. She saw the scars. She had scars too, the kind that didn't show, and maybe that was why she understood what no one else in that barn seemed to grasp. The mare wasn't mean. The mare was terrified. Dutch Carmichael sighed and lowered his gavel. Folks, I can't in good conscience sell an animal this volatile without proper disclosure. This mare's been through 4 owners in 2 years. Each one sent her back. She's kicked through stall doors, bitten handlers, and last month she put a trainer in the hospital with 3 broken ribs. If anyone here wants to take her on, you're doing so with full knowledge she's dangerous. Otherwise, I'm calling this and she goes to salvage. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Salvage meant the slaughterhouse, meant a mare this young would be gone before winter ended, rendered down to meat and glue and whatever parts could be sold. The crowd began to disperse, satisfied with the afternoon's entertainment. Garrett Voss untied his jacket from the rail and headed for the exit, already talking about the upcoming timber festival, about how Sterling would sweep every category. Wren felt something crack open inside her chest, a feeling too big for her small body, too urgent to contain. Her hand reached out before her mind caught up, fingers stretching toward the mare as if she could touch her from 30 feet away. Her lips moved, shaping a word that had no sound, and tears blurred her vision until the barn swam into watercolor smears of brown and gray and that terrible, beautiful red. Iris noticed her niece's distress and knelt down, her face creased with worry. Honey, we need to go. There's nothing we can do here. But Wren wasn't listening. She pulled free from Iris's gentle grip and moved through the dispersing crowd, weaving between legs and elbows, drawn forward by something she couldn't name. The mare's head swung toward her, nostrils flaring, and the handler tightened his grip on the pole, ready to intervene. Stay back, little girl, he barked. This one's not safe. Wren stopped at the rail. She was close enough now to see the flecks of sweat on the mare's neck, close enough to smell the sharp scent of fear that every animal carries when it knows its time is running out. The mare stared at her, and Wren stared back, and in that moment something passed between them that had no language, no logic, only the recognition of one broken thing seeing another. The barn had gone quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. People had stopped to watch, curious despite themselves, as the small child raised one hand and pressed it flat against the top rail of the fence. The mare took a step forward, then another. The handler hissed a warning, but the mare ignored him, her focus entirely on the child who stood perfectly still, hand outstretched, waiting. When the mare's muzzle touched Wren's palm, every person in that barn felt it. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis, reorganizing itself around this one impossible moment. The mare's breath was warm and damp against Wren's skin, and for the first time, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In 4 months, Wren Holloway opened her mouth and sound came out. It wasn't a word. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was something. Please. That single syllable, carried on a breath of air that tasted like sawdust and hope, traveled across the barn and found Iris Holloway standing frozen near the exit. Iris turned, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with shock because her niece, her silent, shattered niece, had just spoken, had just asked for something. And what she was asking for was the one thing in the world that made absolutely no sense. The Pinewood Livestock Exchange sat on the eastern edge of town, where the timber mill used to run before the logging companies pulled out and left nothing but rust and memories. The building itself was older than most of the people who used it, with walls that leaned slightly inward as if bowing under the weight of all the transactions that had passed through over the decades. Cattle had been sold here, horses, sheep, once even a llama that nobody knew quite what to do with. The floor was permanent sawdust over concrete, swept but never truly clean, and the smell was the smell of every livestock barn everywhere. Manure and hay and the particular musk of animals that know they're being judged. Dutch Carmichael stood in the center of the ring with his gavel still raised, though he'd forgotten he was holding it. The mare remained at the rail, her muzzle still touching the child's palm, and the child, this slip of a girl in an oversized jacket, stood as if rooted to the spot. The handler with the pole shifted his weight uncertainly, glancing at Dutch for guidance, but Dutch had none to give. In all his years, he'd seen stubborn horses, mean horses, horses that bucked and bit and raised hell, but he'd never seen one respond to a human touch the way this mare was responding now. Her ears, which had been pinned flat against her skull since the moment she entered the ring, slowly rotated forward. Her eyes, still showing white at the edges, began to soften, the wildness in them banking down to embers. Garrett Voss had paused near the door, annoyed at the delay, and now he turned back with an expression of theatrical disbelief. "Oh, this is precious," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "The demon horse and the mute kid. Somebody write a fairy tale." A few people laughed, but it was uncomfortable laughter, the kind that happens when you're not sure if you should be amused or ashamed. Iris Holloway pushed through the crowd, her seamstress hands rough from years of threading needles, and her face showing the strain of 4 months spent trying to hold together a life that kept threatening to come apart. She reached Wren and placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, we need to leave. That horse is dangerous." Wren didn't move. Her eyes never left the mare's face, and her hand remained pressed to the fence rail as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the earth. The mare shifted, turning her head slightly so that one dark eye regarded Iris with what could only be described as assessment. Iris felt the strange sensation of being measured by something that understood far more than it should, and despite herself, despite every rational thought screaming that this was madness, she found she couldn't pull Wren away. Not yet. Not when her niece had just spoken for the first time since the funeral. Dutch stepped forward, his boots scuffing through sawdust. "Ma'am, I appreciate what just happened here, I do. But that animal's not safe. She's hurt people. We were about to send her to salvage." Iris swallowed hard, her mind racing through calculations she couldn't possibly make work. "How much?" The question came out strangled, barely audible. Dutch blinked. "Ma'am? How much for the mare?" The barn went silent again. A different kind of silence, heavy with judgment and disbelief. Dutch looked at Iris, then at Wren, then back at the mare who stood perfectly still now, her breathing steady, her focus entirely on the child. He ran a hand over his weathered face. "Ma'am, I can't in good conscience sell you this horse. You've got a child there. This mare's dangerous. She's put professional trainers in the hospital." Iris felt something twist in her chest, a strange cocktail of fear and desperate hope. She thought about the mill house where they lived, about the old barn that hadn't held an animal in 15 years, about the savings account that was meant for emergencies and had already been depleted twice this year. She thought about her sister, Wren's mother, who had died in a car accident on a rain-slick road, and about how Wren hadn't cried at the funeral, hadn't spoken, had just stood there like a ghost of herself. And then she looked at her niece's face and saw something she hadn't seen in 4 months. She saw hope. $50, Iris said, her voice stronger now. "That's what I can afford. $50 and I'll sign whatever waiver you need." The crowd erupted in whispers. Garrett Voss laughed outright, a cruel bark of sound. $50 for salvage meat? Lady, you're doing the slaughterhouse's job for them. That horse will kill someone in your family within a week. Iris turned to face him, and though she was a small woman who spent her days bent over a sewing machine in a house that creaked in the wind, something in her expression made Garrett take a half-step back. "My family is my concern," she said quietly. "Not yours." Dutch Carmichael cleared his throat, shifted his weight, looked at the mare one more time. The animal hadn't moved except to breathe, hadn't shown any sign of the violence that had defined her for the past 2 years. He thought about the slaughterhouse, about the waste of it, about how sometimes you make decisions based on what feels right rather than what makes sense. "All right," he said finally. $50 and you sign a release saying you understand the risks. You'll need a trailer." Iris felt her heart hammering. "We don't have a trailer." A voice spoke from the back of the barn, gravelly with age and rough with tobacco. "I got one she can borrow." An old man emerged from the shadows near the tack room. Someone Iris recognized vaguely from town but couldn't name. He was lean as jerky, with hands that showed a lifetime of working with animals, and he walked with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had earned their aches. "Colby Marsh," he said, extending a calloused hand to Iris. "Used to train horses before my back gave out. I'll lend you my trailer and help you load her, no charge." Dutch looked at Colby with something like relief, glad to share the responsibility of this mad decision. "You sure about this, Colby?" The old man shrugged. "Sure as I am about anything. That mare's been handled wrong, that's plain. But I saw what just happened. Sometimes animals know things we don't." The paperwork was handled quickly, Iris signing documents with shaking hands while Wren stood vigil at the fence, her palm still resting against the rail, the mare still standing close enough that their connection felt almost physical. Money changed hands, $50 in crumpled bills that represented a week of mending clothes and hemming curtains. Garrett Voss left in disgust, his boots striking the ground with aggressive force, already composing the story he'd tell at the feed store about the crazy woman and her doomed kid. The crowd dispersed slowly, some people shaking their heads, others watching with morbid curiosity to see how the loading would go. Whether the mare would revert to the monster she'd been or maintain this strange, inexplicable calm. Colby brought his trailer around, an old 2-horse model that had seen better decades, and backed it up to the loading chute. The handler removed the pole but kept the lead rope, eyeing the mare with justified suspicion. "All right," he said to no one in particular. "Let's see if the devil still has manners." He tugged the rope and the mare's ears flattened instantly, her weight shifting back, muscles bunching for a fight. The handler cursed and pulled harder, which only made things worse. The mare reared slightly, hooves striking air, and people scattered. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Dutch said, his earlier willingness evaporating into concern. "Iris, maybe we should reconsider." But Wren had already ducked under the rail. "Wren, no." Iris's scream cut through the chaos, but the child was already moving, already approaching the mare with that same strange stillness that had marked their first encounter. The handler started to intervene, but Colby caught his arm. "Wait," the old man said. "Just wait." Wren stopped 2 feet from the mare's shoulder, close enough that if the animal lashed out there would be no time to react. She raised her hand slowly, deliberately, and this time she touched not the mare's face but her neck, right where the old scars crossed in pale lines against the dark bay coat. The mare froze, her ears rotated forward. Her breathing, which had been coming in sharp, angry bursts, began to slow. Wren's lips moved, and though the words were barely audible, everyone strained to hear. "It's okay," she whispered. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The mare lowered her head until her muzzle touched Wren's hair, and then, as if making a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation she developed, she followed the child toward the trailer. The loading took less than 2 minutes. Wren walked and the mare followed, climbing into the trailer without balking, without resistance, as if the past 2 years of violence had been erased by the simple act of someone choosing gentleness. Colby secured the latch and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Well," he said quietly, "I've seen stranger things, but I can't remember when." The drive to the mill house took 20 minutes through winding roads lined with Douglas fir and western hemlock, trees so tall they seemed to prop up the sky. Jasper was home when they arrived, a lanky 16-year-old who'd been trying to be the man of the house since his aunt had taken in his young cousin. He was sitting on the porch with his homework spread across his lap, and when he saw the trailer his expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Aunt Iris," he called as she climbed out of the truck. "Please tell me you didn't buy a horse. We can barely afford groceries." Iris felt every ounce of her exhaustion crash down at once. "I know," she said simply. "I know it doesn't make sense." But Jasper had already seen Wren climbing out of the passenger seat, had seen the look on her face, and more than that, had heard what Iris told him next. She spoke, "Jasper. For the first time since your aunt died." Wren spoke. Jasper's throat tightened. He looked at his little cousin, who stood by the trailer with her hand pressed against the metal side as if she could feel the mare inside, and he understood that some decisions transcend logic. "What's her name?" he asked. Wren turned to face him, and her voice when it came was still barely more than a whisper, but it was there. It was real. "Crimson," she said. "Her name is Crimson." They unloaded the mare into the old barn that hadn't housed an animal since Iris's father had kept dairy cows 2 decades prior. The stalls were cobwebbed and the wood was soft with rot in places. But it was shelter, and Colby helped Jasper reinforce the gate with spare lumber before he left, promising to check back in a few days. The mare, Crimson now, officially named, stood in the center of the stall and surveyed her new surroundings with wary eyes. Wren remained by the gate, unwilling to leave, and Iris had to coax her inside for dinner with promises that the mare would still be there in the morning. That night, as Iris lay in bed listening to the old mill house settle around her, she thought about all the ways this could go wrong. They had no money for feed, no experience with horses beyond the pony rides Wren had taken at county fairs. The mare was dangerous, damaged, possibly beyond repair. Every logical part of her brain screamed that she'd made a terrible mistake. But then she thought about the word please, about the way Wren's voice had broken through 4 months of silence, and she knew that whatever came next, she'd chosen the only path available. In the barn, Crimson stood in the darkness and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home. The creak of wood, the rustle of wind through the pines, the distant murmur of water from Crooked Creek. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to lower her head and rest. Dawn arrived cold and hesitant, filtering through the pine trees in shafts of pale light that turned the morning mist into something ethereal. Wren woke before anyone else. In the house, dressed in the dark, and slipped outside while frost still clung to the grass. Her breath fogged in the air as she crossed the yard toward the barn, her footsteps crunching softly. She had dreamed of the mare all night, fractured images of dark eyes and tangled mane, of scars that told stories no one had bothered to translate. The barn door groaned on hinges that needed oil, and the sound echoed in the quiet morning. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of old wood and fresh hay that Iris had somehow scrounged from a neighbor the night before. Wren moved slowly down the center aisle, her hand trailing along the stall doors until she reached the one where Crimson stood. The mare was awake, ears swiveling toward the sound of approaching footsteps. In the dim light, her coat looked almost black, the scars invisible except as subtle variations in texture. She watched Wren with an intensity that might have frightened someone else, but Wren understood that kind of watching. It was the vigilance of someone who had learned that safety was temporary and kindness was often a prelude to pain. Wren stopped at the stall door and simply stood there, not reaching, not speaking, just existing in the same space. Minutes passed. The light through the barn's high windows shifted incrementally, painting new angles across the floor. Crimson shifted her weight, took a step closer, then stopped. Another minute passed. Another step. When the mare's muzzle finally touched Wren's palm through the bars of the stall door, Wren felt something loosen in her chest. A knot she hadn't known was there beginning to unravel. "Good morning," she whispered, and the words felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar after so many weeks of silence. Crimson exhaled, warm breath against Wren's skin, and for a moment they simply breathed together, two creatures learning the rhythm of each other's existence. Behind them, footsteps announced another presence. Jasper appeared in the barn doorway, his jacket half-zipped, hair sticking up in sleep-rumpled chaos. He'd brought a bucket of water, sloshing slightly as he walked. "I figured she'd be thirsty," he said, his voice low to avoid startling the mare. Wren nodded but didn't move away. Jasper set the bucket down carefully and studied his cousin. This small girl who had been locked inside herself for so long that he'd started to wonder if she'd ever find her way back out. Seeing her now, seeing the way she stood with her hand pressed to the mare's face, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. He felt hope. "You think she'll let you in the stall?" he asked. Wren considered this, her head tilting slightly. "I don't know," she said. "Not yet." The words came easier now, as if speaking to Jasper was different from speaking to adults with their worried eyes and careful tones. "Maybe she needs time." Jasper nodded, understanding more than he would have a day ago. "Yeah," he said. "Time's something we can give her." They stood together in the barn as the morning brightened, Watching Crimson drink from the bucket, Wren eventually slid under the stall door. The mare drank deeply, water dripping from her muzzle, and when she finished she returned to the gate, positioning herself close to Wren again. Jasper noticed the scars then, really noticed them, white lines crisscrossing the mare's flanks and shoulders, some old and faded, others newer, angrier looking. "What happened to her?" he asked quietly. Wren's expression darkened. "People hurt her," she said simply. "People who didn't understand." Jasper felt his jaw tighten. He thought about Garrett Voss and his mocking laughter, about the crowd at the auction treating this animal like a spectacle, like entertainment. He thought about how easy it was for people to write something off as broken when really it was just scared. "I won't let anyone hurt her again," he said, and he meant it with a fierceness that surprised him. Wren looked up at her cousin, this lanky teenager who was trying so hard to be strong for everyone, and she reached out and took his hand. "Me neither," she said. Iris found them like that an hour later, standing vigil at the stall door, and the sight made her throat tighten. She'd spent the night doing math that wouldn't balance, adding up feed costs and vet bills and all the other expenses that came with keeping a horse they couldn't afford. She'd come to the barn prepared to have a difficult conversation about reality and responsibility and the limits of what their family could manage. But then she saw Wren holding Jasper's hand, saw the way her niece's face had color in it again, animation instead of the blank mask she'd worn for months, and Iris knew she couldn't take this away. Not yet. Not when it might be the only thing keeping Wren tethered to the world. "We need to talk about logistics," Iris said, her practical nature asserting itself even as her heart bent toward mercy. "Feed, water, mucking out the stall. This is a lot of work, and we're all going to have to pitch in." Jasper straightened, shoulders squaring. "I can handle the heavy stuff before school and after. Mucking stalls, hauling water. I've got it." Wren turned to face her aunt, and her voice when she spoke was stronger than it had been. "I'll do everything else," she said. "I'll feed her and brush her and stay with her. Promise." Iris looked at this child who had barely functioned for 4 months, who had drifted through days like a ghost, and saw determination blazing in her eyes. She thought about her sister, about how Wren's mother had always believed in taking chances on broken things, how she'd rescued 3-legged dogs and birds with damaged wings and never once calculated the cost against the outcome. "All right," Iris said finally, "but we do this carefully. That mare's been through trauma and she's capable of violence. We don't take unnecessary risks. Understood?" Both children nodded, solemn as vows. Iris sighed and ran a hand through her hair, already mentally rearranging the household budget, already calculating how many extra mending jobs she'd need to take on. "Well then," she said, "let's figure out what we're doing." The day unfolded in a series of small discoveries. Colby Marsh arrived mid-morning with a truckload of supplies, hay bales and grain sacks and basic tack that he claimed he didn't need anymore. He showed Jasper how to properly muck a stall, how to check hooves for stones, how to measure out feed portions. He taught Wren the basics of grooming, demonstrating with slow, careful movements how to use a curry comb, how to read a horse's body language, how to recognize the difference between fear and aggression. Crimson tolerated the lesson with wary patience, her muscles twitching under the brush but her hooves staying planted. "She's testing you," Colby explained to Wren, "seeing if you'll hurt her when she's vulnerable. Every time you don't, you're building trust." The old trainer watched Wren work with an expression that shifted between concern and fascination. The child had an instinct for this, a natural understanding of pressure and release, of when to push and when to simply exist. She never forced, never rushed, just moved with a quietness that seemed to calm the mare in ways that technique alone never could. "You've got a gift," Colby told her as the sun climbed toward noon. "Don't waste it by being careless." Wren nodded seriously, the brush moving in long, steady strokes down Crimson's neck. "I won't," she promised. By afternoon, word had spread through Pinewood Hollow about Iris Holloway's mad decision. The seamstress who bought the demon horse. People called it foolishness, called it a disaster waiting to happen. At the general store, shoppers whispered about it over produce bins. At the diner, waitresses speculated about how long it would take before someone got seriously hurt. Garrett Voss held court at the feed store, regaling listeners with exaggerated accounts of the mare's violence, predicting tragedy with the confidence of someone who wanted to be proven right. His father, Victor Voss, who owned the largest horse operation in the county, listened to his son's pronouncements and said nothing, but his eyes were thoughtful. That evening, as shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, Wren sat on an overturned bucket outside Crimson's stall and simply talked. She told the mare about her mother, about the accident, about how the world had gone silent in her head for a while because speaking hurt too much. She told her about the mill house and Crooked Creek, about Jasper's terrible jokes and Aunt Iris's constant worry. She told her things she hadn't told anyone, secrets that had festered in the silence, and Crimson stood with her ears pricked forward, listening in the way that animals do, without judgment, without expectation. When Iris came to collect her for dinner, she found Wren asleep against the stall door, her hand reaching through the bars, and Crimson standing guard over her like something out of an old legend. The mare's eyes reflected the lantern light as Iris approached, and there was a warning in that gaze, a clear message that said this child was under protection now. Iris felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with cold. She knelt beside Wren and gently shook her awake. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly. "You need to eat." Wren stirred, disoriented for a moment, then focused on her aunt's face. "Is she okay?" she asked immediately. "She's fine," Iris assured her. "But you need to take care of yourself too." Wren stood reluctantly, her hand trailing along the stall door as she backed away. Crimson watched her go, and for the first time since entering this barn, the mare lowered her head and began to eat the hay in her stall, no longer too stressed to accept sustenance. That night, over a dinner of soup and bread that Iris had stretched as far as it would go, the three of them sat around the kitchen table and talked about the future. Jasper had done research on his phone, looking up training methods and dietary requirements. Wren had questions about everything, her curiosity unleashed after months of silence. Iris listened to them both and felt the weight of responsibility settling deeper into her bones. She thought about the bills stacked on her desk, about the sewing machine that needed repairs, about the roof that leaked when it rained hard. She thought about all the practical reasons this was impossible. And then she looked at Wren's animated face, at the light that had returned to her eyes, and she thought that maybe some things were worth being impossible for. The next morning arrived with rain, steady and cold, turning the world gray and sodden. Wren woke to the sound of water drumming on the roof and immediately thought of Crimson. She dressed quickly and ran to the barn through the downpour, arriving soaked and shivering. The barn roof leaked in 3 places, water dripping into puddles on the floor, but Crimson's stall was dry. The mare stood in the corner, her ears flicking nervously at each crack of thunder. Wren approached slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "It's just noise," she said. "Can't hurt you." But she understood fear of loud sounds, understood how trauma could make your body react before your brain caught up. She slipped into the stall, a decision made without thought, and Crimson's head swung toward her sharply. For a heartbeat they faced each other, girl and horse, and Wren felt the tension in the air, the potential for violence. Then Crimson exhaled and lowered her head, and Wren reached up to stroke her neck. They stood together through the storm, Wren's small hand pressed to Crimson's warm coat, both of them learning that safety could exist in the presence of another, that the world didn't always demand you face its fury alone. When Jasper found them an hour later, he stood in the barn doorway and watched his cousins standing inside the stall with the demon horse, both of them calm, both of them somehow healing each other. He took a photo on his phone, not to share, just to remember, because he knew he was witnessing something rare. Something that couldn't be explained, only experienced. Over the next few days, a routine established itself. Jasper handled the heavy labor before school, mucking stalls and hauling water and reinforcing fence lines. Wren spent every free moment in the barn, grooming Crimson, talking to her, slowly expanding the boundaries of trust. Iris took on extra mending work, her fingers cramping from overtime hours, but she never complained. Colby stopped by regularly, offering guidance and sometimes just sitting on a hay bale watching Wren work, nodding approval at her instincts. The town continued to gossip, predictions of disaster growing more elaborate with each retelling. But inside the old barn by Crooked Creek, something extraordinary was taking root. A child who had lost her voice was finding it again, word by careful word. A mare who had been labeled a demon was discovering that not all humans wielded cruelty. And a family that had been fractured by grief was being stitched back together through the simple act of caring for something more broken than themselves. On the 5th morning, Wren led Crimson out of the barn for the first time. The mare balked at the doorway, muscles tensing, memories of bad things happening in open spaces making her hesitate. Wren stood beside her, hand on her neck, and waited. No pressure, no force, just patience. It took 20 minutes, but eventually Crimson took that first step into the gray morning light, and then another, and soon she was standing in the yard, head high, nostrils flaring at unfamiliar scents. They walked together down the path to Crooked Creek, Wren leading with a loose rope, Crimson following with cautious steps. The water ran clear and cold over smooth stones, and Crimson lowered her head to drink. The first time she'd tasted fresh running water in longer than anyone knew. Wren sat on the creek bank and watched the mare, and she felt something settle in her chest, a peace she hadn't known since before her mother died. Maybe she thought this was what healing looked like. Not dramatic, not sudden, just small moments of trust accumulating until they became something you could stand on. Behind them, unseen, Iris stood at the kitchen window and watched through tears she didn't bother to wipe away. She thought about her sister, about how she would have loved this moment, and she whispered a prayer of gratitude to whatever force in the universe had brought this impossible horse and her grieving niece together. The rain had stopped by afternoon, and the world smelled of wet earth and pine. Wren and Crimson stood together by the creek, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt like something worth moving toward. November settled over Pinewood Hollow with the weight of wet wool, days growing shorter and colder until afternoon felt like evening and evening felt like night. The mill house grew drafty, wind finding gaps in the old boards that Jasper tried to seal with whatever materials he could scavenge. Iris's sewing machine ran late into the nights, the rhythmic thump, and were becoming the soundtrack of their survival. She'd taken on work from 3 neighboring towns, mending everything from wedding dresses to work coveralls, her fingers developing calluses on top of calluses. The money came in thin streams, barely enough to cover feed costs and the propane bill that climbed with each cold snap. Wren spent every moment she could spare in the barn with Crimson. The mare had settled into the routine of their days, but trust remained a fragile thing, easily disrupted by unexpected sounds or sudden movements. Some mornings Crimson would greet Wren with soft nickers and allow herself to be led around the property without resistance. Other mornings she stood in the back corner of her stall, ears pinned, eyes showing white, and Wren learned to read these moods, to understand when to approach and when to simply sit outside the stall and talk until the storm inside the mare's head passed. School became a necessary interruption that Wren endured rather than engaged with. Her teachers noticed she was speaking again, which they marked as progress, but they also noticed the way she stared out windows during lessons, the way her homework came back incomplete or not at all. Mrs. Patterson, her 4th grade teacher, called Iris in for a conference one gray afternoon. "Your niece has been through tremendous trauma," Mrs. Patterson said, her hands folded on her desk in a gesture meant to convey concern. "We understand that, but her grades are slipping and she seems disconnected from her peers. We're worried she's not processing her grief in healthy ways." Iris sat in the too small chair across from the teacher's desk and felt exhaustion settle deeper into her bones. "She's processing it the only way she knows how," Iris said quietly. "She's found something that makes her want to engage with the world again. That has to count for something." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted to something between sympathy and skepticism. "I understand you've taken in a horse," she said carefully. "And while pet therapy can be beneficial, we're concerned that Wren is using this as an escape rather than dealing with her feelings. She needs structure, consistency, perhaps professional counseling." Iris felt heat rise in her chest, defensive anger mixing with the guilt she already carried. "We can't afford professional counseling," she said bluntly. "We can barely afford to keep the lights on. That horse might be unconventional therapy, but it's working. Wren is talking again. She's eating. She's sleeping through the night. That's more than we had a month ago." The teacher nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced but too polite to press further. Just please keep an eye on her academic progress, she said. We don't want her to fall so far behind that catching up becomes impossible. Iris left the school with Mrs. Patterson's words echoing in her head, joining the chorus of doubts that had been building since the auction. She drove home through streets lined with houses that looked warmer and more stable than hers, past the Voss estate with its pristine white fences and heated barn, and felt the weight of comparison pressing down. By the time she pulled into the driveway of the mill house, rain had started again, cold and relentless. She found Wren in the barn, exactly where she expected, sitting on a hay bale with Crimson's head resting against her shoulder. The mare's eyes were half closed, her breathing slow and even, and Wren was reading aloud from a book about wild horses, her voice steady in the dim light. Iris stood in the doorway and watched them. This girl and this horse, both of them damaged, both of them somehow finding solace in each other. She wanted to believe it was enough, that love and determination could overcome practical limitations. But the bills on her desk told a different story, numbers that didn't care about healing or hope. That evening, after a dinner of rice and beans stretched to feed 3, Iris gathered Wren and Jasper at the kitchen table. The overhead light flickered, a reminder that the electrical system was as old and tired as everything else in the house. We need to talk about Crimson, Iris began, and she saw Wren's expression immediately close off, walls going up behind her eyes. Before you panic, I'm not saying we have to get rid of her, Iris continued quickly, but we need to be realistic about what we can manage. Feed costs alone are eating up money we need for other things. The roof needs repairs. Jasper needs new boots before winter really hits. We're stretching resources that were already stretched too thin. Wren's hands clenched into fists on the table. I'll give up everything, she said, her voice rising with desperation. I don't need new clothes or school supplies or anything. Just let me keep her, please. Jasper shifted in his chair, his expression conflicted. I've been looking into part-time jobs, he offered. Maybe the hardware store needs help on weekends. I could contribute more. Iris felt her throat tighten, pride and shame mixing together. You're 16, she said to Jasper. You shouldn't have to support this household. And Wren, honey, this isn't about punishment or taking away something you love. It's about survival. We're barely making it as it is. A heavy silence fell over the kitchen, broken only by the rain drumming against the windows and the old house settling around them. Wren stared at her plate, tears tracking down her cheeks, and Iris felt like the cruelest person alive even though she was only trying to be responsible. What if we found someone to help? Jasper asked suddenly. Like a sponsor or something. Rich people do that for racehorses, right? Support the training costs. Iris shook her head. Those arrangements are for horses with potential, horses that might win something and bring prestige. Crimson is, she paused, searching for words that wouldn't hurt Wren more than necessary. She's not that kind of horse. She's not meant for competition. She's barely safe to handle. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Wren stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She is safe, she said, her voice shaking. With me, she's safe. And she's worth more than any competition horse because she survived. Because she didn't give up even when everyone told her she was worthless. Wren ran from the kitchen before Iris could respond. The sound of her footsteps pounding up the stairs followed by the slam of her bedroom door. Jasper looked at his aunt, his expression pained. She's not wrong, he said quietly. About Crimson surviving, that counts for something. Iris rubbed her face with both hands, feeling every one of her 42 years. I know it does, she said, but we still have to figure out how to pay for it. The next morning arrived cold and clear, frost painting the world in crystalline white. Wren was already in the barn when Iris came to find her, mucking out Crimson's stall with mechanical efficiency. The mare stood in the corner, watching the child work, and there was something protective in the way she positioned herself, as if she understood that Wren was fighting battles the horse couldn't see. Iris leaned against the stall door and watched for a moment before speaking. I'm not trying to take her away from you, she said. I need you to understand that. Wren didn't stop working, the pitchfork scraping against concrete. Then don't, she said simply. Iris sighed. It's not that simple, sweetheart. Money doesn't appear just because we need it. We have to make hard choices. Wren finally stopped and turned to face her aunt, and the expression on her face was older than 9 years old had any right to be. When Mom died, she said, everyone kept telling me that time would make it hurt less, that I'd learn to live with it. But it didn't get better. It just got quieter, like I was disappearing inside myself. She gestured toward Crimson. She brought me back. She needed someone who understood what it felt like to be that scared, and I needed something that made me feel like I could still matter to someone. If you take her away, I'll disappear again. I know I will. The raw honesty of it hit Iris like a physical blow. She thought about her sister, about the last conversation they'd had before the accident, about how her sister had made her promise to take care of Wren no matter what. She'd thought that meant keeping her fed and clothed and safe. She hadn't understood it might mean keeping her tethered to life itself through an abused horse and mounting debt. I'll figure something out, Iris heard herself say. I don't know how yet, but I will. Wren's expression cracked, relief and hope flooding in. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. Later that morning, Colby Marsh arrived with his truck and found Iris sitting on the porch steps, her head in her hands. He climbed out slowly, his arthritic joints protesting the cold, and settled onto the step beside her without asking permission. Heard you're having money troubles, he said without preamble. Small town, he added when Iris looked at him in surprise. People talk. Iris laughed without humor. Of course they do. Probably taking bets on how long before we give up the horse. Colby pulled out a pouch of tobacco and began rolling a cigarette with practiced ease. Some are, he admitted. Garrett Voss is leading that particular charge. But others are watching something different. They're watching that little girl bring a broken horse back from the edge, and they're seeing something they didn't think was possible anymore. He lit the cigarette, took a drag, then continued. I've been training horses for 50 years. Seen every method, every technique, every shortcut people think will work. Most of it's garbage dressed up as expertise. But what your niece is doing with that mare, that's the real thing. That's what actual healing looks like. And it's rarer than people realize. Iris felt tears pressing at the back of her eyes. That doesn't pay the feed bill, she said quietly. Colby nodded. No, it doesn't. But it might pay something else. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. There's a community fund, he said, handing it to her. For families dealing with hardship. It's not charity exactly. More like neighbors helping neighbors. I took the liberty of putting in an application on your behalf. They approved a 3-month grant for horse care expenses. Iris unfolded the paper and stared at the numbers, her vision blurring. She couldn't finish the sentence. It's not permanent, Colby warned. 3 months to figure out something more sustainable. But it's breathing room. She looked at this old man who barely knew them, who had no obligation to care about their struggles, and felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. Why are you doing this? She asked. Colby took another drag of his cigarette and gazed out at the barn where Wren's voice could be heard talking to Crimson. Because I'm old enough to recognize when something matters, he said. And what's happening in that barn matters more than most people will ever understand. That afternoon, Iris told Wren about the grant, and the relief on her niece's face was so profound it made Iris understand how much fear the child had been carrying. 3 months felt like a lifetime when you'd been counting days. But as the initial relief faded, Iris found herself lying awake at night doing different calculations. 3 months would carry them through winter, but then what? The grant was a bridge, not a destination, and she still had no idea what waited on the other side. Around town, reactions to the news were mixed. Some people nodded approval, glad to see the community fund used for its intended purpose. Others, particularly those in Garrett Voss's orbit, saw it as throwing good money after bad. At the feed store, Garrett himself held court with his usual audience, his voice carrying across the aisles. 3 months, he announced with satisfaction. That's all they bought themselves. Come spring, when that demon horse still hasn't turned into a miracle, they'll be right back where they started. Except now they'll have wasted community resources too. His father, Victor Voss, who had stopped in to pick up mineral supplements, listened to his son's pronouncement and felt a familiar disappointment settle in his chest. Garrett had been raised with every advantage, the best training, the finest horses, connections that opened doors before he even knocked. Yet he'd developed none of the character those advantages should have built. Victor thought about the Holloway family, about their ramshackle barn and their impossible horse, and found himself more curious than dismissive. At school, news of Wren's situation spread through the peculiar osmosis of children who overheard adult conversations and translated them into playground politics. Some kids approached her with careful kindness, offering to share their lunches or inviting her to join games at recess. Others kept their distance, as if poverty and grief might be contagious. Garrett Voss's younger sister, a sixth grader named Ashley, started a rumor that Wren was crazy, that she talked to horses because she couldn't make human friends. The rumor gained traction the way cruel things often do, spreading faster than truth. Wren heard the whispers but found she cared less than she might have before Crimson. The opinions of children who didn't understand felt distant and unimportant compared to the real work waiting for her at home. She'd learned that there were different kinds of connection, and the one she'd found with the Mare mattered more than fitting in with people who saw her brokenness before they saw her. Jasper, however, cared quite a bit about the rumors. He heard them third-hand from a friend whose sister was in Wren's grade, and the protective fury that rose in him was immediate and hot. He found Ashley Voss after school one day, cornered her near the bike racks with 3 of her friends watching. "You need to stop spreading lies about my cousin," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Ashley rolled her eyes, secure in her social superiority. "I'm not spreading lies," she said. "Everyone knows your family is a charity case now, and your cousin is weird. She bought a crazy horse with donated money. That's not normal." Jasper felt his hands clench into fists and forced himself to breathe, to not give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. "Wren has more courage in her little finger than you'll ever have," he said. "She's trying to save something everyone else gave up on. That's not weird. That's brave." Ashley's friends shifted uncomfortably, sensing the conversation had moved beyond casual gossip into something more serious. "Whatever," Ashley said, but her voice had lost some of its certainty. "Just keep your charity case family away from people who actually matter." Jasper walked away before he said something he'd regret, his jaw tight with anger. He thought about telling Wren what had happened, then decided against it. She had enough to carry without adding the weight of his protective rage. That evening, he threw himself into barn work with extra intensity, hauling water and reinforcing fence posts until his muscles burned and his anger had somewhere to go. Wren found him as the sun was setting, his breath coming in harsh clouds in the cold air. "You okay?" she asked, her perceptiveness cutting through his attempts at normalcy. Jasper set down the post-hole digger and looked at his cousin, this small, fierce person who had been through more than most adults would face in a lifetime. "Yeah," he said, "just making sure everything's solid for winter." Wren studied him for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. She knew he was lying, but she also understood that sometimes people needed to carry their own burdens privately. "Okay," she said, "but if you want to talk, I'm good at listening now." Jasper felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Thanks, kid," he managed. "I'll remember that." As November deepened toward December, the rhythms of their life with Crimson became more established. Wren's handling of the mare grew more confident, her understanding of equine body language becoming instinctive. She could tell when Crimson was relaxed by the soft set of her eyes, when she was nervous by the tension in her flanks, when memories of past trauma were surfacing by the way her breathing would change. Colby continued his visits, offering guidance but increasingly just observing, recognizing that Wren had a gift that couldn't be taught, only nurtured. The mare's physical condition improved visibly. Her coat gained luster as proper nutrition and consistent care worked their slow magic. The worst of her scars faded from angry red to pale silver. She put on weight, her ribs becoming less prominent, her muscles filling out. But the psychological scars ran deeper, and those would take longer to heal if they ever healed completely. There were still bad days when Crimson would panic at shadows or sounds, when she would refuse to let anyone near her, when the demon the auction crowd had seen would flash behind her eyes. On those days, Wren learned patience that went beyond her years. She would sit outside the stall and talk about nothing important, her voice a steady anchor in whatever storm Crimson was weathering internally. Sometimes it took hours before the mare would approach the gate, would lower her head and accept touch. But each time it happened, each small victory over fear, felt like a promise that healing was possible even when it seemed impossibly far away. Iris watched all of this from the margins, still worrying about money, still taking on too much work, still calculating how many days until the grant ran out. But she also saw changes in her household that couldn't be measured in dollars. Wren was engaged with life again, talking not just to Crimson but to all of them, asking questions, expressing opinions, becoming visible again after months of ghost-like existence. Jasper had found purpose beyond survival, taking pride in his contributions to Crimson's care. Even Iris herself felt something shifting, a sense that they were building something together rather than just enduring separate struggles under the same roof. One evening in early December, as the first real snow began to fall, the three of them stood together in the barn watching Crimson eat her dinner. The mare had finally relaxed enough to eat while they were present, a milestone Colby had said might take months to achieve. The sound of her chewing, the soft movements of her tail, the occasional contented sigh, all of it felt like a benediction on their efforts. "We're doing something right," Jasper said quietly, and though he was talking about the horse, Iris understood he meant something larger. They were doing something right as a family, finding their way through grief and hardship by focusing on something outside themselves. "Yeah," Iris agreed, her arm around Wren's shoulders. "We are." But in the back of her mind, the countdown continued. The grant would last through February. Spring would come with its own demands and expenses. And unless something changed, unless they found a way to make this sustainable, all of this fragile progress would be built on sand. She pushed the thought away and focused on the moment, on the snow falling softly outside the barn, on Wren's peaceful expression, on the mare who had somehow become central to their survival. Tomorrow would bring its own problems. Tonight, they could rest in the small victory of a horse eating dinner without fear. Winter arrived in earnest during the second week of December, bringing snow that accumulated in drifts against the barn and turned Crooked Creek into a ribbon of black water cutting through white landscape. The mill house struggled against the cold, ice forming on the inside of windows overnight, and Iris added extra blankets to everyone's beds while keeping the thermostat lower than comfort demanded. The propane bill was already higher than she'd budgeted for, even with the grant money, and every degree mattered. In the barn, Crimson grew a thick winter coat that made her look almost shaggy, her dark bay coloring deepening to something close to black except where the light caught it right. Wren spent hours brushing out the tangles, her fingers working through the dense fur while she talked about everything and nothing, her voice a constant in the mare's world. The progress they'd made felt solid now, built on repetition and patience rather than any single breakthrough moment. Crimson would walk beside Wren without a lead rope, following her around the property like an oversized dog. She'd learned to stand for hoof cleaning, to accept blankets during the coldest nights, to eat grain from Wren's hand without the nervous snatching that had characterized her early days. To anyone watching closely, it was clear that something remarkable was happening in that ramshackle barn. But most people in Pinewood Hollow weren't watching closely. They'd moved on to other gossip, other dramas, dismissing the Holloway situation as a temporary curiosity that would resolve itself predictably when spring came and reality reasserted itself. Victor Voss, however, was paying attention. He'd made it his business to drive past the mill house several times over the past month, always with some excuse about checking fence lines or meeting with contractors. What he saw intrigued him in ways he hadn't expected. He'd spent 40 years in the horse business, had bred champions and trained winners, had developed an eye for potential that rarely missed. The mare he'd seen dragged into the auction ring that October day had been written off by everyone, including himself. But the glimpses he caught of her now, standing calm in the yard while a child brushed her coat, or walking alongside that same child with no restraint, suggested something his professional judgment had failed to recognize. The mare wasn't broken. She'd been traumatized, and there was a difference. On a cold morning 2 weeks before Christmas, Victor Voss pulled his truck into the mill house driveway and climbed out before he could reconsider. Iris saw him from the kitchen window and felt her stomach drop. The Voss family represented everything they weren't: wealth and stability and the kind of social standing that came from generations of success. She dried her hands on a dish towel and met him on the porch, her posture defensive despite her attempts at civility. "Mr. Voss," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "What can I do for you?" Victor removed his hat, a gesture of respect that surprised her. "Mrs. Holloway, I apologize for arriving unannounced. I was hoping I might speak with you about your mare." Iris felt her defenses rise higher. "If this is about your son's harassment," she began, but Victor raised a hand gently. "It's not," he said. "Garrett speaks for himself, not for me. I'm here on different business entirely." He glanced toward the barn where Wren's voice could be heard singing something off-key. "I've been watching what you and your niece have accomplished with that horse," he continued, from a distance, respectfully, "and I'm impressed. What you've done in 2 months would take most professional trainers 6 months or more, if they could do it at all." Iris didn't know how to respond to praise from someone she'd assumed was an enemy by association. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "Wren has a gift with her." Victor nodded. "She does. Which is why I'd like to make a proposal. The Timber Festival is in March, as you probably know. We sponsor several events, including a demonstration category for young handlers and rescue animals. It's not a competition exactly, more of a showcase. I'd like to invite your niece and Crimson to participate." The words hung in the cold air between them. Iris processed them slowly, looking for the trap, the hidden cost. "Why?" she asked bluntly. "What do you gain from this?" Victor smiled slightly, appreciating the directness. "Honestly, it would be good for the festival to show that rehabilitation is possible, that horses written off as dangerous can be brought back with the right approach." And he added, "There's a modest stipend for participants. $500. It's not charity, it's payment for contributing to the educational aspect of the event." $500. Iris felt the number reverberate through her. That was almost 2 months of feed costs. That was the difference between making it through spring and having to make impossible choices. But she also knew that exposing Wren and Crimson to public scrutiny, especially the kind of crowd the Timber Festival drew, could undo months of careful progress. "I'll need to discuss it with Wren," she said carefully. "And with Colby Marsh. He's been advising us." Victor nodded. "Of course. I'm not asking for an answer today. Think it over. If you're interested, come by the festival office next week and we'll go over the details." He turned to leave, then paused. "Mrs. Holloway, one more thing. My son has been unkind to your family. That's on me for not raising him better. If he causes you any more trouble, you tell me directly. I'll handle it." He climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving Iris standing on the porch trying to make sense of what had just happened. She found Wren in the barn, as expected, with Crimson's head resting over her shoulder while the child read aloud from a library book about mustangs. The image was so peaceful it hurt to interrupt, but Iris needed to have this conversation before she talked herself out of it. "Mr. Voss was just here," she said, and watched Wren's expression immediately cloud with suspicion. "Not Garrett," she added quickly. "His father, Victor. He offered us something." She explained the proposal, watching Wren's face cycle through confusion, fear, and then something that might have been excitement. "A demonstration?" Wren asked. "Like showing people what Crimson can do?" Iris nodded. "Showing them how far she's come. But it would be in front of a lot of people, and you know how Crimson reacts to crowds and noise. Could be too much for her." Wren was quiet for a long moment, her hand absently stroking Crimson's neck. The mare's eyes were half closed, relaxed in a way she never was around anyone except Wren. $500, Wren said finally. "That's a lot." "It is," Iris admitted. "It would help us keep going. But only if you're comfortable with it. Only if you think Crimson can handle it." Wren looked at the mare, really looked at her, assessing with the instinct she'd developed over 2 months of constant attention. "She's stronger now," Wren said slowly. "She's not the same horse they saw at the auction. Maybe people need to see that. Maybe it would help other horses if people understood they can heal." Iris felt pride and fear mixing in her chest. "You're wise beyond your years," she said softly. "But this is your decision. I won't push you either way. That evening, they called Colby and explained the situation. The old trainer listened carefully, asking questions about the format of the demonstration, the size of the expected crowd, the setup of the arena. When they finished, he was quiet for so long they thought the call had dropped. I think you should do it, he said finally. But we need to prepare properly. That means desensitization work, getting Crimson used to noises and movement and strange environments. We've got 3 months. It's enough time if we're smart about it. So began a new phase of training, more structured and goal-oriented than anything they'd done before. Colby arrived 3 times a week, bringing equipment and expertise. They set up obstacles in the yard, tarps that flapped in the wind, poles to walk over, tight spaces to navigate. They played recordings of crowd noise through a portable speaker, starting quiet and gradually increasing the volume over weeks. They introduced Crimson to umbrellas and flags and balloons, anything that might appear at a festival, desensitizing her to each one methodically. Some sessions went smoothly, Crimson approaching new challenges with cautious curiosity. Other times she reverted to the frightened, aggressive horse she'd been, rearing away from stimuli or pinning her ears and refusing to cooperate. On those difficult days, Wren learned patience at a level that tested her 9-year-old understanding of the world. She learned to recognize when pushing forward would do more harm than good, when to end a session early and try again tomorrow. Colby taught her about pressure and release, about rewarding the smallest try, about reading the subtle signs that indicated whether fear or defiance was driving behavior. You're learning things most people don't understand until they've been doing this for decades. Colby told her one afternoon as they watched Crimson finally walk calmly past a row of flapping flags. You've got instinct that can't be taught. Don't waste it. At school, word spread about the upcoming demonstration. The reaction was predictably mixed. Some kids thought it was cool, asking Wren questions about horse training and what the festival would be like. Others, particularly those in Ashley Voss's social circle, saw it as further proof of the Holloway family's strangeness. Ashley herself approached Wren in the cafeteria one day, her expression a calculated mixture of false concern and barely concealed malice. I heard you're going to embarrass yourself at the Timber Festival, she said loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. My brother says that Demon Horse is going to freak out and hurt someone. Probably you. Wren looked at Ashley and felt something shift inside her. 3 months ago, this kind of confrontation would have sent her retreating into silence. But she'd spent the past 2 months working with an animal everyone had written off, proving that patience and understanding could overcome fear and trauma. Ashley Voss's opinion suddenly seemed very small and very unimportant. Crimson isn't a demon, Wren said clearly, her voice carrying across the cafeteria. She's a horse who was hurt by people who didn't understand her, and she's healing because someone finally gave her a chance. Maybe if more people thought like that, there'd be fewer broken things in the world. The cafeteria had gone quiet, kids watching this confrontation with the fascination children have for social drama. Ashley's face flushed red, caught between embarrassment and anger. Whatever, she muttered. We'll see what happens in March. She walked away quickly, her friends trailing after her, and Wren felt Jasper's presence beside her before she saw him. He'd been sitting at a nearby table and had witnessed the entire exchange. That was pretty badass, little cousin, he said quietly, pride evident in his voice. Wren managed a shaky smile, adrenaline still coursing through her. I'm tired of people deciding what's possible before they even try, she said. Jasper squeezed her shoulder. Yeah, he agreed. Me too. As winter deepened and Christmas approached, the mill house took on a quality of determined optimism that hadn't existed before. Iris managed to scrape together enough money for a small tree and modest gifts. Jasper strung lights around the porch that had been in storage since before his aunt died, their colored glow warming the cold nights. Wren made ornaments out of construction paper and hung them in the barn where Crimson could see them, as if the mare needed to be included in their celebrations. On Christmas morning, they opened presents around the tree, simple things like new gloves and used books and homemade cookies. But Wren's favorite gift came from Colby, who arrived with a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a leather halter, beautifully crafted and obviously expensive, with Crimson's name tooled into the noseband. For the demonstration, Colby explained. She should look like what she is, a horse worth caring about. Wren hugged him with fierce gratitude, and the old trainer patted her back awkwardly, and used to such displays of emotion. You've earned it, he said gruffly. Both of you have. January arrived with brutal cold and snow that seemed endless. Training continued in whatever weather allowed, Wren and Crimson working together in the yard while their breath fogged the air. The mare's confidence grew visibly, her responses to cues becoming more refined, her trust in Wren expanding to include Jasper and occasionally even Iris. She would never be the kind of horse that strangers could approach casually, but within her small circle of trusted humans, she'd found safety. February brought the first hints of thaw, icicles dripping from the barn roof and patches of brown earth appearing through the snow. The grant money was running out, the final check arriving with a note thanking them for their participation in the program and wishing them well. Iris looked at the numbers in her account and knew they had perhaps 6 weeks before crisis arrived again. The demonstration stipend wasn't enough to solve their problems long-term, but it would buy time to find other solutions. Training intensified as March approached. Colby arranged for them to practice at the fairgrounds twice, getting Crimson accustomed to the arena where the demonstration would take place. The first visit was difficult, the mare balking at the unfamiliar environment and the lingering sense of other horses. But the second visit went better, and by the third, Crimson was walking through the space with relative calm, her trust in Wren overriding her fear of the unknown. A week before the festival, Colby sat down with Wren and walked her through exactly what the demonstration would entail. You'll enter the arena with Crimson on a lead rope, he explained. There'll be narration about her background, about rescue and rehabilitation. You'll show basic handling, some simple obstacles, and then finish with free work if she's comfortable, letting her move around the arena while you guide her with voice and body language. Wren listened carefully, her expression serious. What if she gets scared? What if she panics? Then you end the demonstration early, Colby said firmly. No one expects perfection. The point is showing progress, showing that damaged horses can heal. Even if things go wrong, you'll have shown people something real. The night before the festival, Wren couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle around her and thought about everything that had led to this moment. Her mother's death and the silence that had followed. The auction and the mare no one wanted. The slow, difficult work of building trust. The community that had helped them survive when survival seemed impossible. She thought about Garrett Voss and his predictions of failure, about Ashley and her casual cruelty, about all the people who had decided what was possible without ever trying. And she thought about Crimson, sleeping in the barn, trusting Wren to keep her safe even when the world had taught her that safety was a lie. Morning arrived gray and cold but without rain. A small mercy. Iris made breakfast that no one could eat, nerves stealing appetite from all of them. Jasper loaded Crimson into Colby's trailer with practiced ease, the mare walking up the ramp without resistance. Wren rode in the back seat clutching the leather halter Colby had given her for Christmas, her fingers tracing Crimson's name over and over like a prayer. The Timber Festival fairgrounds were already crowded when they arrived, cars filling the parking areas and people streaming toward various exhibition halls and arenas. The smell of fried food and sawdust filled the air, and music played from speakers mounted on poles. It was overwhelming even for the humans, and Wren's heart clenched thinking about how Crimson would react. They unloaded in a quiet area behind the main arena, a space Victor Voss had arranged specifically for demonstration participants. Several other horses were there, all of them rescue cases of various kinds, and their handlers nodded greetings to Wren with the camaraderie of people engaged in similar difficult work. Crimson backed out of the trailer with her head high, nostrils flaring, every muscle tense. But she didn't bolt, didn't rear, just stood pressed close to Wren's side as if the child were the only solid thing in a world gone unstable. It's okay, Wren murmured, her hand on Crimson's neck. I'm right here. We're doing this together. Colby appeared with a program and showed them the schedule. They were fourth in the demonstration lineup, which meant about an hour wait. Victor Voss approached as they were reviewing the details, his expression warm but professional. Miss Holloway, he said with a slight nod to Wren. Your mare looks well. You should be proud of the work you've done. Wren found her voice despite her nerves. Thank you, Mr. Voss. She's worked hard too. Victor smiled at that. Indeed she has. I'll be watching your demonstration with great interest. The hour passed in a strange blur of hyper-awareness and dissociation. Wren stayed with Crimson, talking constantly, keeping the mare's attention focused on her rather than the chaos around them. Iris and Jasper hovered nearby, offering support through their presence. Colby checked equipment and offered last-minute advice. And then suddenly their names were being called over the loudspeaker, and it was time. Wren led Crimson toward the arena entrance, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The arena was smaller than it had seemed during practice sessions, and the stands were packed with people. Hundreds of faces turned toward the entrance with various expressions of curiosity and expectation. Crimson stopped at the gate, her body rigid with tension, and for a terrible moment Wren thought the mare would refuse to enter. But then Crimson looked down at her, their eyes meeting, and something passed between them that had been built over 3 months of patient work. Crimson took a breath and walked forward. The arena announcer's voice filled the space, explaining Crimson's background, the abuse and neglect, the multiple failed attempts at rehabilitation, the auction where she'd been bound for slaughter. Wren heard it all from a distance, her focus entirely on the mare beside her. They walked a circuit of the arena at a steady pace, Crimson's ears flicking constantly but her stride remaining even. They approached the first obstacle, a tarp spread on the ground, something that had terrified Crimson in early training. The mare hesitated, snorted, then followed Wren across it without balking. The crowd murmured appreciation. They navigated poles and tight turns, Crimson responding to Wren's cues with increasing confidence. And then came the moment Wren had been both anticipating and dreading. She unclipped the lead rope and stepped back, leaving Crimson free in the center of the arena. For several heartbeats, the mare stood motionless, processing this new freedom. The crowd was silent, everyone holding their breath. Then Wren raised her hand in the signal they'd practiced, and Crimson began to move. She walked a circle around Wren, then transitioned to a trot at another cue, her movements fluid and controlled. She changed direction when asked, came to Wren when called, demonstrated every element of the trust they'd built together. And then something unexpected happened. Music had been playing softly in the background throughout the demonstrations, and the song changed to something slower, more melodic. Crimson's ears pricked forward, her pace slowing, and she began to move in a way Wren had never seen before, almost dancing, her natural grace finally able to express itself without fear. The crowd recognized what they were seeing, a horse not performing but choosing to be beautiful, and the silence broke into genuine applause. Wren felt tears streaming down her face, but she kept her focus on Crimson, kept the connection strong between them. When the demonstration ended and Wren clipped the lead rope back on, the applause continued, growing louder. People were standing, not everyone but enough to matter, and the sound washed over them like absolution. They exited the arena to find Iris sobbing, Jasper grinning so wide his face must have hurt, and Colby nodding with satisfaction. Victor Voss approached with an envelope containing their stipend and something else, a business card. I know several people who saw that demonstration who'll want to talk to you about their own difficult horses, he said to Wren. With your aunt's permission, of course. You have a future in this if you want it. The rest of the festival passed in a blur. People approached them constantly, wanting to hear Crimson's story, to thank Wren for showing them something they hadn't believed possible. Garrett Voss appeared briefly, his expression unreadable, and muttered something that might have been congratulations before disappearing into the crowd. Ashley Voss was nowhere to be seen. As the sun began to set and they loaded Crimson back into the trailer, Wren felt exhaustion settling into her bones. But it was good exhaustion, the kind that comes from doing something that matters. She pressed her face against Crimson's neck one last time before closing the trailer. We did it, she whispered. We showed them. The drive home felt different than the drive there had felt, lighter somehow despite the physical tiredness. At the mill house, they unloaded Crimson and settled her in her stall with fresh hay and water. The mare was tired too, her head hanging low, but when Wren left the barn, Crimson nickered softly as if to say goodbye until morning. Inside the house, Iris opened the envelope Victor had given them and counted the money carefully. $500 as promised, plus an additional $300 with a note that read, "For feed costs through summer. Consider it an investment in important work." Iris sat at the kitchen table and allowed herself to cry properly, relief and gratitude overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. They had breathing room now, several months at least, and the business card Victor had given them represented potential future income. It wasn't security exactly, but it was possibility, and possibility was something they'd been running short on. That night, Wren lay in bed and thought about the mare who had been called a demon, who had been written off as worthless and dangerous. She thought about how Crimson had walked into that arena despite her fear, had trusted Wren enough to be vulnerable in front of hundreds of strangers. She thought about the applause and the tears she'd seen in some faces, and the way even skeptical expressions had softened as they watched what healing could look like. Her mother had died and taken Wren's voice with her, but Crimson had given it back, had shown her that broken things could be made whole if someone cared enough to try. The world outside remained harsh and uncertain, full of Garrett Vosses and Ashley Vosses who would always be ready to mock what they didn't understand. But inside this small circle, inside this ramshackle barn by Crooked Creek, they had built something that mattered. A child who had lost her mother had found her voice. A mare who had lost her trust had found her courage. And a family barely holding together had discovered that sometimes the most impossible choices lead to the most necessary transformations. Spring was coming, bringing with it new challenges and uncertainties. But they would face it together, this unlikely family bound by circumstance and choice, held together by a horse that everyone else had given up on. In the barn, Crimson dreamed whatever horses dream, safe in her stall, warm under her blanket, no longer afraid that morning would bring new cruelty. And in the house, 3 humans slept the sleep of people who had done something worth doing, who had taken what the world called impossible and made it real through nothing more than stubborn faith and relentless care. The demonstration was over, but the story was just beginning. Written not in grand gestures but in daily acts of showing up, of choosing compassion over convenience, of believing that healing is always possible even when everyone says it isn't. They had shown Pinewood Hollow and themselves that demons are often just damaged souls waiting for someone brave enough to see past the fear to the truth underneath. And that truth, simple and profound, was that love expressed through patient action can accomplish what force and judgment never will. March gave way to April, and the landscape around Pinewood Hollow transformed from winter's stark geometry into something softer and more forgiving. Buds appeared on the cottonwoods along Crooked Creek, and the morning air carried the scent of thawing earth and new growth. The demonstration at the Timber Festival had shifted something fundamental in how the town perceived the Holloway family, and more specifically, how they perceived what was possible with animals deemed beyond saving. The business card Victor Voss had given Wren sat on the kitchen windowsill for 3 days before Iris worked up the courage to actually use it. She wasn't accustomed to asking for opportunities, more familiar with the posture of someone trying not to be noticed while they struggled. But the additional money Victor had included with their stipend would only stretch so far, and the prospect of regular income doing something Wren excelled at was too practical to ignore out of pride. She called the first number on a Tuesday afternoon while Wren was at school and Jasper was at his new part-time job at the hardware store. A woman answered, her voice warm and slightly breathless, as if she'd run to catch the phone. "Mrs. Patterson?" Iris asked, reading the name from the card. "This is Iris Holloway. Victor Voss suggested I contact you about your horse." "Oh, thank goodness," Mrs. Patterson said with genuine relief. "I've been hoping you'd call. Victor told me about your niece's work with that mare, and I have a gelding who desperately needs help. The trainers I've hired have all given up on him. They say he's too stubborn, too set in his bad habits. But after seeing what your niece accomplished, I thought maybe there's hope." They arranged a visit for Saturday, and when Iris told Wren about it that evening, the child's reaction was complex, pride mixed with anxiety. "What if I can't help?" Wren asked, her hands twisting in her lap. "What if Crimson was special and I can't do it again?" Iris knelt in front of her niece and took those restless hands in her own. "You didn't fix Crimson because she was special," she said gently. "You helped her because you understood her, because you were patient when everyone else had run out of patience. That's not something that only works once. That's a skill, and skills can be applied to new situations. Colby, who had stayed for dinner and was lingering over coffee, nodded his agreement. Your aunt's right. What you have isn't magic, though it might look like it to people who don't understand. It's empathy and observation and a willingness to meet animals where they are instead of where you want them to be. That's rare, but it's also repeatable. Saturday arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring day that feels like a gift after months of cold. They drove to the Patterson property, which sat on the eastern edge of the valley where the land began its climb toward the mountains. The house was modest but well-maintained, with a small barn and several fenced paddocks. Mrs. Patterson met them in the driveway, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and hands that showed years of physical work. The gelding she led out was a paint horse, brown and white in irregular patches, with intelligent eyes and a body that vibrated with tension. His name was Scout, and according to Mrs. Patterson, he'd been a perfectly pleasant horse until a trail riding accident 2 years prior had left him terrified of anything that resembled the steep terrain where he'd fallen. Now he refused to be ridden, would bolt if pushed, and had developed a habit of rearing that made him dangerous. I've spent thousands on trainers, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice heavy with frustration and sadness. They all say the same thing eventually. Put him down or sell him for pasture ornament status. But he's only 9 years old, and before the accident he was wonderful. I can't give up on him, but I don't know what else to do. Wren approached Scout slowly, reading his body language the way Colby had taught her. The gelding's ears were back, not pinned in aggression but tucked in anxiety. His nostrils flared with each breath, and his weight shifted constantly, ready to flee. She stopped several feet away and simply stood there, not reaching, not demanding, just existing in his space without threat. Minutes passed. Mrs. Patterson started to speak, but Iris touched her arm gently, signaling silence. Scout's ears rotated forward fractionally, his breathing beginning to slow. Wren took one step closer, then waited again. Another step, another pause. When she finally raised her hand, Scout flinched but didn't bolt. She let her hand hover in the air between them, an invitation rather than an imposition, and after what felt like an eternity, Scout stretched his neck and touched his muzzle to her palm. Good boy, Wren whispered. Nobody's going to make you do anything scary. She spent the next hour just being with Scout, walking beside him around the paddock, letting him set the pace and direction. She didn't ask him to do anything except tolerate her presence, and gradually his tension eased. By the end of the session, he was following her without a lead rope, his head lowered to a more relaxed position. Mrs. Patterson watched with tears streaming down her face. I haven't seen him that calm in 2 years, she said. What did you do? Wren considered the question seriously. I didn't do anything, she said. I just let him know he was safe. That's the hard part, though. Making them believe it. They arranged for Wren to come twice a week, working with Scout in sessions that would gradually rebuild his confidence. Mrs. Patterson insisted on paying, offering a rate that made Iris's eyes widen, but Wren negotiated it down to something that felt fair rather than exploitative. It's not about the money, Wren explained with a maturity that surprised even herself. It's about helping him. But the money does help, she added practically, and everyone laughed. Word spread quickly after that. Victor Voss, it turned out, had shown video footage of Crimson's demonstration to several people in the regional horse community. And suddenly Iris's phone was ringing with requests. A mare who wouldn't load into trailers. A gelding with separation anxiety so severe, he'd injured himself trying to escape his stall. A pony who had been kept in isolation so long he'd forgotten how to interact with other horses. Each case was different, each animal carrying its own particular damage, but Wren approached them all with the same fundamental philosophy. Listen more than you direct. Understand before you act. Build trust one patient moment at a time. She worked with Scout twice a week and took on 2 other clients, both within reasonable driving distance. Colby accompanied her to the first few sessions with each new horse, offering guidance and ensuring safety, but increasingly he found himself just observing, marveling at how this 9-year-old child could read equine psychology with an accuracy that professionals twice her age struggled to achieve. She's not just talented, he told Iris one evening. She's gifted in a way that comes along maybe once in a generation. You need to nurture this carefully. Don't let people exploit it or burn her out. Iris took the warning seriously. She established strict boundaries around Wren's time, ensuring school remained the priority and that her niece had time to just be a child. But she also recognized that this work was feeding something essential in Wren, giving her purpose and identity beyond being the grieving kid who'd lost her mother. The income, while modest, made a tangible difference. They could afford to fix the roof properly now instead of patching leaks. Jasper got new boots that actually fit. Iris replaced her aging sewing machine with a better model that would let her take on more complex alterations. Most importantly, Crimson's care was secure, the constant anxiety about feed costs and vet bills finally easing. At school, the social dynamics had shifted in subtle ways. Wren was no longer the silent, traumatized outsider but had become known as the horse girl, which carried its own mixed implications. Some kids thought it was cool and asked endless questions. Others found it strange, this intense focus on animal rehabilitation. Ashley Voss's attitude had evolved from open hostility to something more complex, a mixture of resentment and reluctant respect. She'd been present at the Timber Festival demonstration, had watched Wren succeed where Ashley's own brother had predicted failure, and the cognitive dissonance was visible in how she now avoided Wren entirely rather than actively tormenting her. One afternoon in late April, as Wren was leaving school, she found Garrett Voss leaning against his truck in the parking lot. Her first instinct was wariness, memories of his mockery at the auction still fresh. But his posture wasn't aggressive, and his expression, while not friendly, lacked the cruel amusement that had characterized their previous encounters. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like humility. Wren stopped several feet away, keeping distance between them. "Okay," she said cautiously. Garrett shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I wanted to say I was wrong," he began. "At the auction and after, I said things about you and your horse that weren't fair. My dad showed me the video of your demonstration, and he said something that's been stuck in my head. He said that real horsemanship isn't about dominance or control, it's about partnership. And that I've been confusing having expensive horses with actually understanding them." Wren didn't know what to say. An apology from Garrett Voss was so unexpected it felt almost surreal. He continued before she could formulate a response. "I've been training horses my whole life, or I thought I was training them. But watching what you did with that mare, how you just understood what she needed, it made me realize I don't actually know anything. I've been following my dad's methods, using techniques that work on horses that aren't traumatized. But I've never had to really connect with an animal that was scared or broken. I wouldn't know how." There was genuine vulnerability in the admission, and Wren found her wariness softening slightly. "Crimson taught me more than I taught her," Wren said. "I just had to be willing to listen." Garrett nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "I'm starting to understand that. Anyway, I wanted to apologize. You deserved better from me." He climbed into his truck and drove away before Wren could respond, leaving her standing in the parking lot processing this unexpected development. She told Iris about it that evening, and her aunt listened with a thoughtful expression. "People can surprise you," Iris said. "Sometimes it takes seeing someone succeed at something you failed at to recognize your own limitations. That takes more courage than most people have." As spring deepened into early summer, the routines they'd established began to feel less like survival strategies and more like the actual shape of their lives. Wren's work with client horses expanded to 4 regular cases, each one showing measurable progress. Scout, the paint gelding, had allowed Mrs. Patterson to ride him again for the first time in 2 years, a breakthrough that had both of them in tears. The mare with trailer loading issues now walked calmly into transport, her fear systematically desensitized through patient repetition. Even the isolated pony was learning to interact with other horses again, his social skills slowly returning through carefully managed introductions. Jasper had been promoted to assistant manager at the hardware store, a position that came with better pay and more responsibility. He'd grown into the role of man of the house in ways that went beyond just physical labor, becoming someone Iris could truly rely on, whose judgment she trusted. He'd also started dating a girl from his class, bringing her by the mill house to meet the family and introducing her to Crimson with visible pride. Iris's alteration business had grown through word of mouth, people seeking her out specifically because they'd heard she did quality work for fair prices. She'd hired a neighbor to help with the overflow, turning what had been a desperate hustle into something approaching an actual small business. The mill house itself reflected their improving circumstances. Fresh paint covered the worst of the exterior where the roof no longer leaked. Small improvements accumulated until the place looked less like they were barely hanging on and more like they were actually living there. But the most significant changes were internal, emotional rather than material. Wren no longer carried the weight of silence. Her voice integrated back into her identity, so completely it was hard to remember she'd ever been mute. She laughed easily now, argued when she disagreed, asked questions with the insatiable curiosity of a child who'd rediscovered engagement with the world. Jasper had shed some of the grim determination that had made him seem older than his years, allowing himself moments of actual teenage behavior, hanging out with friends, complaining about homework, being occasionally irresponsible in ways that were developmentally appropriate. Iris still worried. That was her nature and probably always would be. But the worry had shifted from immediate survival to more ordinary concerns about Wren's education and Jasper's future, and whether they were doing right by these children she'd inherited through tragedy. In early June, Victor Voss called with an unexpected proposition. "There's a regional horse expo in August," he said. 3 days of demonstrations, clinics, vendors, everything related to equine care and training. I'm on the organizing committee, and we'd like to offer Wren a featured spot. A clinic on rehabilitation techniques for traumatized horses. It would be a larger audience than the Timber Festival, people from several states, and it comes with a speaker fee of $1,500. Iris felt her breath catch. That was significant money, but it was also significant pressure. "She's 9 years old," Iris said carefully. "I don't want to push her into something she's not ready for." "I understand," Victor said, "which is why I'm asking, not demanding. Talk to her, see what she thinks. But I will say this. What she's doing matters beyond just the individual horses she helps. She's changing how people think about rehabilitation, proving that patience and understanding can accomplish what force never will. That message deserves a bigger platform if she's willing to share it." That evening, Iris presented the opportunity to Wren, laying out both the potential benefits and the pressures it would entail. Wren listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "Can I bring Crimson?" she asked. "To demonstrate with?" "I don't want to talk about her without her there." "We can arrange that," Iris confirmed. "But you need to understand, this would be bigger than the Timber Festival. More people, more attention, more chances for things to go wrong." Wren nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "But if it helps more horses, if it helps people understand that giving up isn't the only option, then maybe it's worth being scared." The decision was made. Over the next 2 months, they prepared with the same methodical approach that had characterized everything since the auction. Colby helped Wren structure a presentation that would be both educational and engaging. They practiced at the fairgrounds again, getting Crimson comfortable with the environment. Wren worked with her client horses and incorporated lessons learned into her planned demonstrations. The expo arrived the second weekend of August, held at a large equestrian center 2 hours from Pinewood Hollow. The facility was impressive, multiple arenas and hundreds of vendor stalls, and crowds that dwarfed anything Wren had experienced before. They arrived the day before Wren's clinic to acclimate Crimson to the environment, and the mare handled it with remarkable composure, her confidence a testament to the foundation of trust they'd built. The morning of the clinic, Wren woke with butterflies rioting in her stomach. Iris made her eat breakfast even though she claimed she couldn't, and Jasper cracked jokes to ease the tension. Colby arrived early and walked Wren through the setup one final time, his presence steady and reassuring. When they entered the arena, Wren was stunned by the crowd. The stands were packed, hundreds of people who had come specifically to see the child trainer everyone was talking about. She felt panic beginning to rise, her breathing going shallow. But then Crimson nudged her shoulder gently and Wren remembered why she was here. Not for the crowd, not for the recognition, but because horses like Crimson deserved advocates who understood their pain. The clinic began with Wren telling Crimson's story, her voice amplified by a microphone that felt strange against her cheek. She talked about the auction, about the laughter and the contempt, about how close Crimson had come to slaughter. She talked about the slow work of building trust, about setbacks and patience, about learning to listen to what the horse was communicating rather than imposing what the human wanted. And then she demonstrated, working with Crimson through various exercises that showed their partnership, the way they moved together with an understanding that went beyond commands and obedience into something that looked almost like conversation. The crowd watched in rapt silence, and when the demonstration concluded, the applause was thunderous and sustained. But the most meaningful part came during the question and answer session that followed. A woman in the second row stood, her voice shaking slightly. "I have a horse who was abused before I got him," she said. "I've been trying to help him for 3 years, but I don't know if I'm doing it right. How do you know when you're making progress versus just maintaining the status quo?" Wren considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Progress isn't always obvious," she said. "Sometimes it's just that the horse has one less bad day, or that something that scared them last week doesn't scare them this week. You have to pay attention to small things because that's where healing actually happens. Not in big breakthrough moments, but in tiny improvements that add up over time." More questions followed, from professional trainers and amateur enthusiasts, from people who worked with rescue organizations and people who'd inherited difficult horses. Wren answered each one thoughtfully, sometimes admitting she didn't know, often turning to Colby for technical details, but always returning to her core philosophy of patience, observation, and meeting animals where they were. When the clinic ended and they led Crimson out of the arena, Wren was mobbed by people wanting to talk, to thank her, to share their own stories. Iris ran interference, protecting her niece from being overwhelmed, but she also saw how Wren was energized by these interactions, how she lit up when discussing horse behavior and rehabilitation techniques. That evening, after Crimson was settled and they'd grabbed dinner at the Expo food court, Victor Voss found them and delivered news that left them speechless. "Several people approached me after your clinic," he said to Wren. "Major people, including representatives from 2 national horse rescue organizations. They want to know if you'd be interested in consulting work, helping develop training protocols for their volunteer handlers. It would mostly be remote, video consultations and written guidelines, but it could become significant supplemental income. And beyond that, there's interest in you speaking at other expos, maybe even developing an instructional video series." Iris felt dizzy with the implications. Wren was 9 years old, and suddenly people were talking about her like she was an established professional. She opened her mouth to say it was too much, too fast, but Wren spoke first. "I want to help if I can," she said carefully, "but I don't want to stop working with actual horses. Talking about it isn't the same as doing it." Victor nodded approvingly. "Smart boundary to set," he said. "I'll make sure any opportunities we pursue allow for that." They drove home late that night, Jasper asleep in the back seat, Wren drowsing against the window, and Iris gripping the steering wheel while her mind raced. 6 months ago they'd been barely surviving, held together by desperation and the last threads of family obligation. Now they had stability, income, opportunity stretching before them in ways she'd never imagined. And all of it traced back to a cold October morning when a traumatized child had reached out to a traumatized horse and both of them had decided, despite everything, to try. The summer passed in a blur of work and growth. Wren balanced her client horses with the new consulting work, learning to articulate her instinctive understanding in ways that others could learn from. She recorded video explanations of her techniques, wrote detailed protocols for different types of trauma responses, and consulted via video call with rescue organizations across 3 states. The money from these activities went into a college fund Iris had opened, savings for a future that now felt possible rather than theoretical. In September, as Wren started 5th grade, the local paper ran a feature article about her titled, "The Horse Whisperer of Pinewood Hollow." Wren hated the nickname, thought it made her sound mystical rather than methodical, but she endured the attention with grace. The article brought more clients, more opportunities, and also more pressure to be exceptional when she often just felt like a kid trying her best. Crimson remained the center of everything, the reminder of why any of this mattered. Every morning before school, Wren spent time in the barn with her, and every evening after homework and client sessions, she returned for more. They'd go on long walks through the property, girl and horse moving through the landscape like parts of the same organism, their bond so complete that words felt redundant. One October evening, almost exactly a year after the auction, Wren sat on the creek bank with Crimson grazing nearby and thought about everything that had changed. Her mother was still gone, that wound still ached, but it had been joined by so much else that the grief no longer defined her entire existence. She'd found her voice, not just literally but figuratively, discovering that she had things worth saying that people wanted to hear. She'd found purpose in helping broken things heal, in proving that patience could overcome trauma. She'd found family in an aunt who'd risen to an impossible challenge and a cousin who'd become more brother than anything else. And she'd found herself, this person who existed not despite her pain but somehow because of it, shaped by loss into someone who understood that healing was possible even when it seemed impossibly far away. Crimson lifted her head and walked over to where Wren sat, lowering her muzzle to the child's hair in a gesture that had become their particular language of affection. Wren wrapped her arms around the mare's neck and whispered thank you into the warm coat, gratitude for everything this horse had given her, for the life they'd built together from the wreckage of what came before. In the house, Iris watched through the kitchen window and felt her own gratitude rising. She thought about her sister, about the promise she'd made to care for Wren, and felt certain she'd kept that promise in ways she'd never anticipated. Not through providing material comfort or conventional stability, but through recognizing when love meant saying yes to something that made no practical sense, trusting that sometimes the heart understands what the head cannot calculate. The mill house was warm now, properly insulated and weatherproofed, but more than that it was filled with the sound of living rather than just surviving. Jasper's laughter from his room where he was on the phone with his girlfriend. The hum of Iris's sewing machine working on a custom order. The distant sound of Wren's voice from the creek bank, talking to Crimson about something only the two of them needed to understand. This was what they'd built from $50 and stubborn faith, from a child's whispered pleas and a community's reluctant generosity. A life that wasn't perfect or easy but was theirs, earned through the daily choice to keep showing up for each other, and for a horse that everyone else had called a demon. The stars emerged one by one above Pinewood Hollow, and the temperature dropped as night settled in. Wren eventually came inside, cheeks pink from cold, and accepted the hot chocolate Iris handed her. They sat together at the kitchen table, this makeshift family, and talked about ordinary things, homework and weekend plans, and whether they needed to stock up on hay before the first snow. Outside in the barn, Crimson stood in her stall, warm and safe and fed, no longer the terrified creature who'd been dragged into an auction ring and laughed at by people who couldn't see past their own limited understanding. She was just a horse now, living a quiet life with people who loved her, and that transformation, simple as it sounded, was nothing short of miraculous. The demon had become just Crimson, and in that shift lay all the proof anyone needed that redemption is always possible if someone cares enough to make space for it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.